Welcome to this journey through one of the most stomach-turning cases ever documented in the blood-soaked history of the Arizona Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and what you had for your last meal. You may find yourself questioning that choice before this tale reaches its horrifying conclusion. We're curious to know how far across the world this story of perverted hospitality reaches its sickening influence. In the scorching desert wasteland of 1875 Arizona Territory, where the sun bleached bones white in a matter of weeks, and where survival often meant making choices that civilized society could never understand, there lived a man whose generosity would become the stuff of nightmares. This is the documented account of what became known as the Perdition Ranch Incident, a series of events surrounding a cattle rancher named Ezekiel Morrison and his establishment near what is now the ghost town of Sulphur Springs, where hungry travelers received more than just beef in their final supper. Arizona Territory in 1875 existed as a harsh frontier where federal authority was distant and often non-existent, where local law enforcement consisted of scattered sheriffs responsible for areas larger than entire eastern states, and where the isolation of ranch life created conditions where systematic predators could operate for years without detection. The territory had been carved from the New Mexico Territory just 12 years earlier, and much of it remained unmapped wilderness, where a man could disappear as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Along what would later become the Butterfield Overland Stage Route, approximately 37 miles southeast of what would become Tucson, stood a modest ranch and way station that served travelers making the perilous journey between California and the developing territories of the Southwest. The establishment was owned and operated by Ezekiel Morrison, a man who had arrived in Arizona Territory in 1872, claiming to be a former cattle rancher from Texas, seeking new opportunities in the expanding frontier. Morrison appeared to be exactly what the isolated region needed, a hard-working settler who understood both ranching and hospitality, who could provide fresh meat and safe lodging to travelers crossing the dangerous expanse of desert that surrounded his property. His ranch, which he had named Perdition in a moment of frontier humor that would prove grimly prophetic, became known throughout the territory for the quality of its beef and the generous portions served to weary travelers. Contemporary accounts describe Morrison as a man of imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet tall with the kind of weathered appearance that came from years of hard work under the desert sun. Travelers who encountered him during his early years in Arizona Territory consistently praised his hospitality and his ability to provide exactly what hungry, exhausted pioneers needed most: substantial meals of fresh beef, clean beds, and the kind of hearty welcome that made the dangers of frontier travel seem temporarily forgotten. The ranch itself was strategically positioned to take advantage of a reliable water source, a crucial consideration in the desert environment where most settlements failed due to inadequate water supplies. Morrison had constructed his buildings around a natural spring that provided sufficient water for his cattle, his guests, and his own domestic needs, creating an oasis of comfort in the midst of an otherwise unforgiving landscape. What made Morrison's establishment particularly attractive to travelers was his reputation for always having fresh meat available, even during seasons when other ranchers struggled to maintain adequate food supplies. His cattle seemed remarkably healthy and numerous, despite the challenging conditions that made successful ranching difficult throughout the territory. Visitors consistently commented on the exceptional quality and flavor of the beef served at Perdition Ranch, describing it as unlike any cattle they had encountered elsewhere in the Southwest. Morrison's success in maintaining consistent meat supplies was attributed to his claimed expertise in desert ranching techniques that he supposedly had developed during his years in Texas. He told visitors that he had learned special methods for raising cattle in arid conditions, techniques that allowed his animals to thrive where others failed. These explanations seemed plausible to travelers who lacked ranching experience and were grateful for the abundant, well-prepared meals that Morrison provided without apparent regard for cost or scarcity. The first documented irregularity associated with Morrison's ranch appears in territorial records from late 1874, when several families traveling through the area reported that their relatives had failed to arrive at expected destinations, despite having been seen at Perdition Ranch during their journeys. These early reports were initially dismissed as typical frontier mishaps. Travelers often changed their plans, encountered delays, or fell victim to the numerous hazards that made desert travel dangerous even for experienced pioneers. However, the pattern of disappearances associated with Morrison's ranch gradually attracted the attention of territorial officials, who began to notice that an unusually high number of missing person reports mentioned Perdition Ranch as the last known location where vanished travelers had been seen. By early 1875, at least 7 separate families or traveling groups had failed to reach their destinations after stopping at Morrison's establishment, a statistical anomaly that exceeded normal expectations for frontier travel casualties. Deputy Territorial Marshal James Cartwright was assigned to investigate the unusual number of disappearances associated with Perdition Ranch. Cartwright's initial reports, preserved in territorial archives, reveal his growing suspicion that Morrison's hospitality might conceal something more sinister than simple business success. His investigation, conducted discreetly to avoid alarming Morrison or compromising potential evidence, gradually uncovered details that transformed routine missing person cases into one of the most horrifying discoveries in territorial history. Cartwright's investigation began with interviews of travelers who had stayed at Perdition Ranch but had continued safely to their destinations. These interviews revealed consistent patterns in Morrison's behavior that seemed innocent individually but created a disturbing picture when considered collectively. Multiple witnesses reported that Morrison showed particular interest in travelers who were carrying substantial funds or valuable possessions, engaging them in lengthy conversations about their destinations, their schedules, and their plans for establishing new lives in the territories. More troubling were reports about Morrison's cattle operation, which several knowledgeable travelers had found suspicious despite their gratitude for his hospitality. Experienced ranchers who had visited Perdition Ranch reported seeing surprisingly few cattle for an operation that consistently provided large quantities of fresh meat. The animals they did observe seemed unusually nervous and displayed behavioral patterns that suggested they were not entirely comfortable with their environment or their owner. One particularly detailed account came from Samuel Hendricks, a cattle buyer from El Paso, who had visited Morrison's ranch in January 1875. Hendricks's written report to territorial authorities, discovered in 1952, provides disturbing insights into the operation of Perdition Ranch. Morrison's cattle are strange animals, skittish beyond normal expectations and displaying behavior patterns I have never observed in 40 years of ranch work. They seem afraid of their owner and avoid areas of the ranch where normal cattle would be expected to graze. Hendricks's report continues with observations that would prove significant. Most disturbing is the meat itself. While undeniably flavorful and well prepared, it has characteristics that do not match any beef I have encountered in decades of cattle trading. The texture, the flavor, even the appearance when cooked seems somehow different from normal range cattle. When I questioned Morrison about his feeding methods and breeding stock, his explanations were evasive and contradictory. The cattle buyer's suspicions were further aroused by Morrison's reluctance to discuss business opportunities or to show his guest the full extent of his ranching operation. Morrison seemed eager to limit my visit to the main house and immediate surrounding areas, claiming that his cattle were grazing in distant pastures that would require extensive travel to reach. This explanation seemed implausible given the desert environment and the limited range available for grazing in the immediate area. Hendricks concluded his report with a recommendation that would prove prophetic. There is something fundamentally wrong with Morrison's operation that goes beyond simple business practices. His evasiveness, combined with the unusual characteristics of his cattle and meat, suggests activities that merit thorough investigation by territorial authorities. I recommend immediate and comprehensive examination of his ranching claims and methods. Deputy Marshal Cartwright's investigation was complicated by the remote location of Perdition Ranch and by Morrison's carefully cultivated reputation as a generous and helpful member of the territorial community. Morrison had contributed to community projects, provided assistance to travelers in distress, and maintained cordial relationships with other settlers and ranchers throughout the region. Any investigation that challenged his respectability would need to be based on concrete evidence rather than suspicions and rumors. The breakthrough in Cartwright's investigation came in March 1875, when he discovered evidence that Morrison's claimed background as a Texas cattle rancher could not be verified through official sources. Records from Texas counties where Morrison claimed to have operated showed no evidence of his ranching activities, while his alleged previous addresses proved to be non-existent locations that suggested deliberately falsified personal history. More disturbing was Cartwright's discovery that Morrison had arrived in Arizona Territory with resources that seemed incompatible with his claimed background as a struggling rancher seeking new opportunities. Land records showed that he had purchased his ranch property with gold coin, paying substantially more than the land's assessed value in what appeared to be an effort to complete the transaction quickly, without questions about financing or references. Cartwright's investigation also revealed that Morrison had made suspicious purchases from suppliers throughout the territory, including unusually large quantities of salt, lime, and chemicals that seemed excessive for normal ranching operations. When questioned about these purchases, suppliers reported that Morrison had paid in gold and had been evasive about his intended uses for materials that appeared more suitable for industrial processing than agricultural activities. The marshal's most significant discovery came when he learned that Morrison had been seen in the company of known criminals and drifters who had subsequently vanished without explanation. These associations suggested that Morrison might be involved in activities beyond simple ranching, possibly including robbery or other criminal enterprises that could explain both his wealth and the disappearances of travelers who had visited his ranch. Armed with this circumstantial evidence, Cartwright obtained authorization for a formal search of Perdition Ranch and its surrounding properties. The search, conducted in April 1875 with a detachment of territorial militia, was designed to locate physical evidence of criminal activity while maintaining the legal protections required for territorial law enforcement procedures. The search of Morrison's main ranch buildings initially revealed little beyond the expected equipment and supplies associated with cattle ranching operations. However, more detailed examination uncovered hidden compartments and concealed storage areas that contained items suggesting activities far removed from legitimate ranching. These discoveries included substantial quantities of personal effects that appeared to belong to travelers, including jewelry, clothing, documents, and other possessions that Morrison could not adequately explain. Most damning was the discovery of detailed records that Morrison had apparently maintained of his guests and their possessions. These records, written in Morrison's hand and containing information that could only have been obtained through systematic observation and documentation, revealed that he had been cataloging the wealth and vulnerability of travelers who visited his ranch for purposes that seemed incompatible with legitimate business operations. However, the most horrifying discovery was made when searchers examined Morrison's cattle operation more closely. Investigation of his slaughtering facilities and meat processing areas revealed evidence that the beef served to his guests had not come entirely from cattle. Hidden in various locations throughout the ranch were human remains that had been processed using techniques typically employed for butchering livestock. The discovery of human remains processed as meat created immediate scandal throughout Arizona Territory and prompted one of the most extensive criminal investigations in territorial history. Physical evidence suggested that Morrison had been systematically murdering travelers who visited his ranch, then processing their remains using meat preparation techniques before serving the results to subsequent guests who unknowingly consumed human flesh along with their beef. Analysis of the discovered remains revealed that Morrison's operation had been far more extensive than initial investigations had suggested. Forensic examination, limited though it was by 1875 standards, indicated that at least 12 individuals had been killed and processed at Perdition Ranch over a period of approximately 2 years. The victims appeared to include men, women, and children from various traveling groups that had stopped at the ranch seeking food and shelter. The methodology revealed by the investigation was both systematic and grotesquely efficient. Morrison apparently had developed techniques for selecting victims who were unlikely to be immediately missed, killing them in ways that minimized noise and disturbance, and processing their remains using equipment and methods that disguised the true source of the meat he served to subsequent guests. The entire operation reflected careful planning and regular repetition that transformed murder into a routine business practice. Evidence suggested that Morrison selected victims based on their perceived wealth and their vulnerability to attack. Travelers carrying substantial funds or valuable possessions were apparently targeted preferentially, while those who were expected by relatives or business associates at specific destinations were generally allowed to continue their journeys unharmed. This selective targeting allowed Morrison to acquire wealth through robbery, while minimizing the risk of generating immediate investigations. The killing methods employed by Morrison appeared to vary depending on circumstances and victim characteristics, but physical evidence suggested that he typically attacked his victims from behind using blunt instruments that produced fatal injuries without creating excessive noise or obvious signs of struggle. The remote location of his ranch meant that such attacks could be conducted without risk of discovery by neighbors or passing travelers. Most disturbing was the systematic nature of Morrison's meat processing operation. Evidence indicated that he had developed efficient methods for butchering human remains using techniques adapted from cattle slaughtering practices. The processed meat was then mixed with beef from his legitimate cattle operation and served to guests who had no way of detecting the true nature of what they were consuming. The discovery of Morrison's cannibalistic practices created profound shock and revulsion throughout Arizona Territory and beyond. Newspaper coverage of the case attracted national attention and contributed to public perceptions of the frontier as a place where the normal restraints of civilized behavior could not be maintained. The revelation that travelers seeking hospitality had unknowingly consumed human flesh, served by their host, created lasting trauma among survivors who had visited Perdition Ranch. Morrison himself was found dead in his ranch house when searchers arrived to arrest him. Evidence suggested that he had committed suicide rather than face capture and trial, though some investigators suspected that he might have been killed by associates who feared exposure of their own involvement in his criminal activities. His death prevented detailed investigation of his motivations and methods, leaving many questions about his operation unanswered. The investigation of Perdition Ranch revealed additional evidence of Morrison's criminal activities beyond murder and cannibalism. Hidden caches throughout the property contained substantial quantities of stolen goods, including money, jewelry, documents, and personal effects that had been taken from his victims. The total value of recovered stolen property suggested that Morrison had acquired considerable wealth through his systematic predation on travelers. Documentary evidence discovered at the ranch indicated that Morrison had maintained detailed records of his criminal activities, including assessments of potential victims, inventories of stolen property, and what appeared to be accounting records for his cannibalistic meat processing operation. These documents revealed a level of systematic planning and record-keeping that transformed what might have been impulsive crimes into a carefully managed business enterprise. The records also suggested that Morrison might not have operated alone. References to unnamed associates and coded communications indicated that his operation might have been part of a larger criminal network that exploited the vulnerability of travelers in remote frontier areas. However, the investigation was unable to identify these potential accomplices, and Morrison's death prevented interrogation that might have revealed the full extent of criminal activities associated with Perdition Ranch. The aftermath of the Perdition Ranch discoveries had lasting impacts on travel patterns and business practices throughout Arizona Territory. Travelers became significantly more cautious about accepting hospitality from strangers, while legitimate ranchers and innkeepers found it necessary to provide additional assurances of their respectability to overcome suspicions created by Morrison's crimes. The territorial government implemented new regulations requiring registration and inspection of establishments that served travelers, though enforcement of these regulations was limited by the vast distances and limited personnel available for oversight activities. The case also prompted improvements in communication systems that made it easier to track the movements of travelers and investigate disappearances more quickly and thoroughly. Legal proceedings related to the Perdition Ranch case were complicated by Morrison's death and by questions about territorial jurisdiction over crimes that might have involved victims from multiple states and territories. Property recovered from the ranch was eventually distributed to families of identified victims, though many remains could not be identified due to the degraded condition in which they were discovered. The psychological impact of the Morrison case extended far beyond its immediate legal consequences. The revelation that a seemingly respectable rancher had been systematically murdering guests and serving their flesh to subsequent visitors challenged fundamental assumptions about trust, hospitality, and human nature that were essential to frontier survival. The case became a cautionary tale that influenced frontier culture for generations. Contemporary accounts reveal the profound trauma experienced by individuals who realized they had unknowingly consumed human flesh during visits to Perdition Ranch. Several survivors required medical treatment for psychological distress, while others reported persistent nightmares and eating disorders that continued for years after learning the truth about Morrison's operation. The case also had significant impact on law enforcement practices and procedures throughout the Western Territories. Morrison's success in operating his criminal enterprise for several years without detection highlighted weaknesses in territorial law enforcement systems and prompted reforms designed to improve communication and coordination between different jurisdictions. Medical professionals who examined the remains discovered at Perdition Ranch provided insights into Morrison's methods and the extent of his criminal activities that were not available to the original investigators. Modern forensic analysis techniques, applied to preserved evidence from the case, have revealed additional details about Morrison's operation and confirmed the systematic nature of his crimes. Analysis of bone trauma patterns found among the remains has provided insights into Morrison's killing methods and has confirmed that his victims were murdered rather than dying from natural causes or accidents. Evidence of systematic dismemberment and processing techniques demonstrates the calculated nature of his cannibalistic practices and reveals the extent to which he had developed efficient methods for converting human remains into consumable meat. Toxicological analysis of preserved tissue samples has revealed that some victims were apparently drugged before being killed, suggesting that Morrison used chemicals to incapacitate his victims before attacking them. This finding indicates additional premeditation and planning that contradicts any suggestion that his crimes were impulsive or opportunistic, rather than systematic predation. The discovery of Morrison's cannibalistic practices contributed to academic and popular interest in the psychological and cultural factors that enable such extreme criminal behavior. Criminologists have studied the case as an example of how isolation, opportunity, and personal psychopathology can combine to produce criminal activities that exceed normal understanding of human deviance. Anthropological analysis of the Morrison case has focused on the cultural and social factors that enabled his crimes to continue undetected for such an extended period. The case illustrates how frontier conditions created opportunities for predatory behavior while simultaneously making detection and prevention extremely difficult. The isolation of frontier ranches meant that criminal activities could be conducted without immediate observation by neighbors or authorities, while the normal dangers of frontier travel provided plausible explanations for disappearances that might otherwise have prompted immediate investigation. These environmental factors created conditions where systematic predators could operate with virtual impunity if they understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of their situation. Contemporary discussion of the Morrison case has also emphasized the role of frontier hospitality traditions in enabling his crimes. The cultural expectation that travelers should be welcomed and fed by isolated settlers created opportunities for Morrison to gain access to potential victims while appearing to fulfill normal social obligations. The betrayal of hospitality represented by Morrison's crimes was particularly shocking to frontier communities that depended on mutual assistance and trust for survival in harsh environments. The revelation that a host could systematically murder and cannibalize his guests violated fundamental assumptions about human behavior that were essential to frontier social organization. Modern psychological analysis of Morrison's crimes has identified patterns that remain relevant to contemporary understanding of serial murder and cannibalistic behavior. His systematic approach to victim selection, killing, and body disposal demonstrates the kind of organized thinking that characterizes the most dangerous categories of serial killers. The cannibalistic aspects of Morrison's crimes have been analyzed in the context of contemporary research into anthropophagic behavior and the psychological factors that enable individuals to engage in consumption of human flesh. His ability to serve human meat to unsuspecting guests while maintaining an appearance of normal social interaction demonstrates remarkable psychological compartmentalization that exceeds typical criminal behavior. The Morrison case has also contributed to understanding of how criminal behavior can be masked by legitimate business activities and social respectability. His success in operating a criminal enterprise while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate rancher illustrates the dangers posed by predators who understand how to exploit social expectations and institutional blind spots. Contemporary law enforcement professionals have studied the Morrison case as an example of how criminal networks can exploit geographic isolation and jurisdictional limitations to operate with reduced risk of detection. His remote location and his understanding of territorial law enforcement limitations enabled him to conduct systematic crimes that might have been detected and prevented in more populated or better policed areas. The case has also influenced modern approaches to investigating disappearances and suspicious deaths in remote areas. Morrison's success in explaining away victim disappearances through plausible alternative explanations demonstrates the importance of systematic investigation and careful analysis of patterns that might otherwise be dismissed as coincidental. Educational institutions have used the Morrison case as a teaching tool for courses in criminal justice, psychology, anthropology, and frontier history. The case provides insights into multiple aspects of criminal behavior, social organization, and institutional response that remain relevant to contemporary analysis of deviant behavior and social control. The pedagogical value of Morrison's story lies partly in its illustration of how extreme criminal behavior can emerge from seemingly normal social and economic circumstances. Students who study the case gain insights into the complex relationships between individual psychology, social environment, and institutional capacity that influence the development and control of criminal behavior. Research into Morrison-related topics continues to produce new publications and academic papers that explore different aspects of his crimes and their broader historical and social significance. This ongoing scholarship reflects both the intrinsic interest of his case and its value as a window into larger patterns of frontier criminality and social organization. Archaeological investigation of the former Perdition Ranch site has provided additional insights into Morrison's operation and has confirmed many details that were documented by the original investigation. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed evidence of additional criminal activities that were not detected by 1875 law enforcement methods. Ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis have identified areas where additional remains might be buried, suggesting that Morrison's criminal activities were even more extensive than originally suspected. However, the remote location of the site and the costs associated with comprehensive archaeological investigation have limited the scope of these research efforts. The Morrison case has influenced popular culture representations of frontier crime and has contributed to fictional works that explore themes of betrayed hospitality and hidden evil in frontier settings. His story has inspired novels, films, and other media that use his crimes as a starting point for exploring broader themes of trust, survival, and moral choice in extreme circumstances. These popular culture adaptations generally emphasize the horror and betrayal represented by Morrison's crimes, while using his story to examine contemporary concerns about trust, authenticity, and the potential for evil to hide behind normal social facades. The enduring appeal of his story reflects continuing fascination with extreme criminal behavior and the conditions that enable such deviance to flourish. The site where Perdition Ranch once stood remains largely unmarked and uninhabited, though it occasionally attracts visitors interested in frontier history and true crime. The harsh desert environment has reclaimed most traces of Morrison's buildings and operations, leaving little physical evidence of the horrific activities that once occurred there. Local folklore and oral history have preserved various accounts of Morrison's crimes and their impact on territorial communities, though these traditional narratives often include embellishments and fictional elements that complicate historical analysis. Nevertheless, these folk traditions demonstrate the lasting impact that Morrison's crimes had on regional memory and cultural understanding. The legacy of Ezekiel Morrison and Perdition Ranch serves as a permanent reminder of the potential for extreme evil to hide behind facades of respectability and hospitality. His systematic exploitation of frontier hospitality traditions to facilitate murder and cannibalism represents one of the most disturbing examples of predatory behavior in American frontier history. Contemporary discussions of Morrison's crimes often focus on their relevance to modern concerns about trust, authenticity, and the ability to recognize dangerous individuals who present normal or appealing social personas. His success in maintaining an appearance of respectability while conducting systematic atrocities illustrates the continuing challenge of identifying and preventing predatory behavior in contemporary society. The Morrison case reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful, who offer exactly what vulnerable people need most desperately. His transformation of the sacred duty of frontier hospitality into a tool for systematic murder and cannibalism represents a betrayal that transcends individual crime to attack the fundamental bonds of trust that make civilized society possible. Today, as we travel highways and accept hospitality from strangers, Morrison's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear the mask of generosity, and that the most dangerous invitations are sometimes those that promise exactly what we most desperately need. The rancher who fed his neighbors beef and something worse remains one of the darkest figures in American frontier history, a reminder that sometimes the most horrific monsters are those who welcome us to their table and invite us to share their hospitality. The desert winds that blow across the site of Perdition Ranch carry no trace of the horrors that once occurred there, but the memory of Ezekiel Morrison's crimes continues to haunt our understanding of human nature and the thin line that separates civilization from savagery. His story stands as a permanent warning that in a world where survival often depends on the kindness of strangers, we must never forget that some strangers harbor appetites that civilized society cannot imagine, and some hospitality comes at a price too terrible to pay. The investigation into Morrison's background, conducted after his death, revealed layers of deception that extended far beyond his false identity as a Texas rancher. Evidence discovered in his personal effects suggested that he had operated similar establishments in other territories, moving frequently to avoid detection, while perfecting his systematic approach to murder and cannibalism. Documents found hidden in Morrison's ranch house included correspondence with individuals in Colorado, New Mexico, and California who appeared to be operating similar criminal enterprises. These letters, written in coded language that investigators struggled to decipher completely, suggested the existence of a network of predatory innkeepers who shared information about law enforcement activities, profitable hunting grounds, and techniques for avoiding detection. One partially decoded letter, dated December 1874, contained references that investigators believed related to cannibalistic practices and victim processing methods. The letter included discussions of special preparations, enhanced flavoring techniques, and customer satisfaction that seemed to use restaurant terminology to describe the systematic processing and serving of human flesh to unsuspecting guests. This evidence of criminal networking challenged initial assumptions that Morrison represented an isolated case of frontier psychopathy. Instead, it suggested that cannibalistic innkeepers might represent a previously unrecognized category of organized crime that had adapted to the unique conditions and opportunities created by westward expansion and frontier hospitality traditions. The correspondence also revealed that Morrison had been refining his methods through exchange of information with other practitioners, suggesting that his operation represented not the deranged activities of a single madman, but rather a systematic criminal methodology that had been developed and improved through collaboration between multiple predators. Further investigation revealed that several mysterious disappearances and unsolved crimes in other territories might have been connected to Morrison's criminal network. Reports of travelers vanishing after staying at remote inns, combined with accounts of unusually flavorful meat served at isolated way stations, created patterns that seemed consistent with Morrison's methods when viewed in retrospect. However, the investigation was hampered by Morrison's death and by the reluctance of territorial authorities in other regions to acknowledge that they might have similar problems within their jurisdictions. The suggestion that cannibalistic innkeepers might be operating throughout the Western territories threatened to damage territorial reputations and discourage the immigration and investment that were essential for continued development. The scope of Morrison's individual operation was further revealed through detailed examination of his ranch facilities and equipment. Hidden processing areas contained sophisticated apparatus for butchering, preservation, and preparation that exceeded what would be necessary for normal cattle operations. The equipment included specialized tools for human anatomy, chemical preservatives, and cooking implements designed for preparing meat in ways that would disguise its true origin. Analysis of Morrison's kitchen and dining facilities revealed that he had developed elaborate methods for combining human flesh with beef in dishes that would be virtually impossible for guests to identify as containing anything other than cattle meat. His cooking techniques, documented in detailed notes found among his personal papers, demonstrated remarkable culinary knowledge that had been perverted to serve his cannibalistic enterprises. The notes revealed that Morrison had experimented extensively with different preparation methods, seasoning combinations, and cooking techniques to create dishes that would mask the distinctive characteristics of human flesh while enhancing its flavor and acceptability to his unwitting guests. This systematic approach to culinary deception represented a level of planning and expertise that transformed cannibalism from desperate survival behavior into calculated criminal enterprise. Morrison's records also documented his systematic evaluation of different types of human flesh based on the age, gender, and physical condition of his victims. These grotesque assessments revealed that he had developed preferences and selection criteria that treated his victims as livestock to be evaluated for their culinary potential rather than as human beings deserving of moral consideration. The psychological implications of Morrison's systematic approach to cannibalism attracted attention from alienists and early criminal psychologists who attempted to understand the mental processes that could enable such extreme behavior. Contemporary medical professionals who examined his case identified patterns that they believed might help predict and prevent similar criminal development in other individuals. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, a physician and alienist who studied the Morrison case for the Territorial Medical Society, published findings that represented some of the earliest systematic analysis of cannibalistic criminal behavior. Dr. Whitman's report, preserved in Territorial Medical Archives, provides insights into contemporary understanding of the psychological factors that might contribute to such extreme deviance. Morrison's crimes represent more than simple madness or moral depravity, Dr. Whitman wrote. His systematic approach to victim selection, killing, processing, and serving demonstrates organized thinking processes that suggest calculated criminal methodology rather than impulsive psychotic behavior. This individual appears to have developed cannibalistic practices as a business model, rather than as a response to psychological compulsion or survival necessity. Dr. Whitman's analysis continued with observations that proved prescient. The most disturbing aspect of Morrison's case is not the cannibalism itself, but rather his ability to maintain normal social relationships while conducting systematic atrocities. His success in presenting himself as a respectable businessman while engaging in activities that violate the most fundamental human taboos suggests psychological compartmentalization abilities that exceed normal human capacity for deception. The physician's report concluded with warnings about the potential for similar cases. Morrison's criminal methodology could be replicated by other individuals who possess similar psychological characteristics and who find themselves in circumstances that provide comparable opportunities for systematic predation. The isolation and limited law enforcement resources that characterize frontier conditions create environments where such predators could operate with minimal risk of detection. These early psychological analyses of Morrison's case contributed to developing understanding of criminal behavior patterns and influenced approaches to law enforcement and criminal prevention that would be implemented throughout the Western Territories. The recognition that extreme criminal behavior could be systematic rather than impulsive prompted changes in investigative procedures and prevention strategies. The territorial government's response to the Morrison case included implementation of new regulations governing establishments that served travelers, though enforcement remained problematic due to the vast distances and limited personnel available for oversight activities. These regulations required operators to register with territorial authorities, submit to periodic inspections, and maintain records of guests and their activities. However, the effectiveness of these measures was limited by the practical realities of frontier law enforcement and by the resistance of legitimate business operators who resented increased governmental oversight of their activities. Many remote establishments continued to operate without registration or inspection, creating ongoing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by predatory individuals. The case also prompted improvements in communication systems that made it easier to track the movements of travelers and to coordinate investigations of disappearances across territorial boundaries. Telegraph networks were expanded to include more remote areas, while standardized reporting procedures were implemented to facilitate information sharing between different law enforcement jurisdictions. These infrastructure improvements, while beneficial for law enforcement purposes, also created new opportunities for criminal intelligence gathering that sophisticated predators could exploit to avoid detection. The same communication systems that helped authorities track missing persons also provided information that criminals could use to identify vulnerable targets and plan their activities accordingly. The economic impact of the Morrison case extended throughout Arizona Territory and beyond, as travelers became increasingly cautious about accepting hospitality from strangers and sought accommodations only from establishments with verified reputations for safety and legitimacy. This increased caution benefited some legitimate businesses while imposing additional costs on others who found it necessary to provide enhanced security measures and credibility assurances. The case also influenced territorial development patterns, as investors and settlers became more selective about locations and business partners, seeking areas with better law enforcement coverage and more established community oversight mechanisms. Remote areas that had previously attracted settlers seeking independence and minimal governmental interference found it more difficult to attract the population and investment necessary for continued development. Insurance companies began implementing new policies and procedures for covering losses related to frontier travel, with specific exclusions and requirements designed to address the unique risks revealed by cases like Morrison's. These changes increased the costs and complexity of frontier business operations while providing some protection against systematic predation. The long-term psychological impact of the Morrison case on territorial communities was profound and lasting. The revelation that a respected community member had been systematically murdering and cannibalizing guests created trauma that affected social relationships and business practices for generations. Trust between strangers, which had been essential for frontier survival, became much more difficult to establish and maintain. Survivors who had unknowingly consumed human flesh at Perdition Ranch experienced various forms of psychological distress that contemporary medicine was ill-equipped to treat. Several individuals required extended medical care for conditions that would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, while others developed persistent eating disorders and social anxieties that affected their ability to function in normal community relationships. The families of Morrison's victims faced unique challenges in processing their grief and trauma. Unlike typical frontier deaths, which were usually caused by recognizable hazards like disease, accidents, or violence, Morrison's victims had been killed and consumed in ways that violated fundamental human taboos and challenged basic assumptions about civilized behavior. The knowledge that their loved ones had been not only murdered, but also cannibalized, and that their remains had been served to innocent travelers, created forms of trauma that exceeded normal grief responses. Many families found it impossible to achieve psychological closure or to participate in normal mourning processes that depended on being able to honor and remember the deceased in traditional ways. Community religious leaders struggled to address the spiritual and theological questions raised by Morrison's crimes. The systematic violation of human dignity represented by cannibalism challenged conventional religious frameworks and required development of new approaches to providing comfort and guidance to affected community members. Some religious authorities focused on Morrison's crimes as evidence of ultimate evil that confirmed the reality of spiritual warfare and the importance of maintaining strong moral standards. Others emphasized forgiveness and redemption as responses to evil that could help communities heal and move beyond trauma. These different theological approaches created additional divisions within communities that were already struggling to process the horror of Morrison's revelations. The Morrison case influenced frontier educational practices, as parents and teachers grappled with how to prepare children for the realities of frontier life, while maintaining their innocence and optimism about human nature. The case demonstrated that the greatest dangers might come from those who appeared most trustworthy and helpful, challenging traditional approaches to teaching children about safety and stranger awareness. Educational authorities developed new curricula that attempted to balance realistic danger awareness with preservation of the social trust that remained essential for community survival. These programs emphasized the importance of community networks and verification systems while avoiding the kind of paranoia that could undermine social cohesion. The legal precedents established by the Morrison case influenced criminal law development throughout the Western territories. His crimes raised novel questions about jurisdiction, evidence standards, and appropriate punishments for activities that exceeded normal criminal categories. The systematic nature of his cannibalistic enterprise challenged existing legal frameworks that had been designed to address more conventional forms of criminal behavior. Territorial legislators drafted new statutes specifically addressing cannibalism and the systematic exploitation of hospitality traditions for criminal purposes. These laws established severe penalties for such crimes while providing legal frameworks that could be used to prosecute similar cases in the future. However, the effectiveness of these legal measures remained limited by the practical challenges of law enforcement in remote areas, and by the difficulty of detecting crimes that were designed to exploit the normal vulnerabilities of frontier hospitality. Predatory individuals who understood these legal limitations could still exploit systemic weaknesses if they were sufficiently careful and systematic in their criminal activities. The Morrison case contributed to the development of professional law enforcement capabilities throughout the Western territories. The complexity of his crimes and the challenges involved in investigating systematic predation revealed the need for specialized training and resources that exceeded the capabilities of traditional frontier peace officers. Territorial authorities began implementing training programs for law enforcement personnel that included instruction in criminal psychology, systematic investigation techniques, and interjurisdictional cooperation procedures. These programs helped develop more professional approaches to law enforcement while providing officers with tools and knowledge necessary for addressing complex criminal cases. The case also prompted establishment of territorial investigative units that were specifically designed to handle crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries or that required specialized expertise. These units provided resources and capabilities that individual counties and local governments could not afford to maintain independently. Advances in communication technology were accelerated by the need to coordinate law enforcement activities across the vast distances that characterized territorial jurisdictions. Telegraph systems were expanded and improved to provide more reliable information sharing, while standardized reporting procedures were developed to facilitate communication between different agencies and jurisdictions. These technological and procedural improvements benefited legitimate business and social activities while also providing new tools for criminal detection and prevention. However, they also created new vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals could exploit if they understood how to manipulate or avoid the new systems. The Morrison case influenced academic and professional study of criminal behavior in ways that extended far beyond its immediate legal and law enforcement impacts. Early criminologists and psychologists used his case as a foundation for developing theories about the nature of extreme criminal deviance and the social conditions that enable such behavior to flourish. Universities and professional organizations began offering courses and research programs focused on criminal psychology and systematic investigation techniques. These academic programs helped develop the theoretical frameworks and practical methodologies that would evolve into modern criminology and forensic science disciplines. The case also influenced popular and professional literature about frontier life and criminal behavior. Contemporary accounts of Morrison's crimes were published in newspapers and magazines throughout the United States, contributing to public awareness of frontier dangers while sensationalizing aspects of his story that appealed to morbid curiosity. These popular accounts often emphasized the horror and sensational aspects of Morrison's cannibalism while minimizing the systematic and businesslike nature of his criminal enterprise. The resulting narratives contributed to romanticized and distorted perceptions of frontier life that emphasized individual evil rather than the social and economic conditions that enabled such predation. Modern historical analysis of the Morrison case has attempted to correct these distortions while placing his crimes within broader contexts of frontier development and social organization. Contemporary historians emphasize the importance of understanding Morrison's activities as products of specific historical circumstances rather than as isolated examples of individual evil. This historical perspective reveals how frontier conditions created opportunities for systematic predation while simultaneously making detection and prevention extremely difficult. The isolation of frontier establishments, the limited resources available for law enforcement, and the cultural expectations surrounding hospitality all contributed to creating environments where predatory individuals could operate with minimal risk of discovery. Archaeological investigation of the former Perdition Ranch site has provided additional insights into Morrison's operation and has confirmed many details that were documented by the original territorial investigation. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed evidence of systematic processing activities that were not fully understood by 19th-century investigators. Ground-penetrating radar has identified numerous areas of soil disturbance that appear to be burial sites, suggesting that Morrison's criminal activities claimed more victims than were initially documented. However, the remote location and harsh environmental conditions have made comprehensive excavation difficult and expensive. Soil analysis has revealed chemical signatures consistent with large-scale processing of organic materials, supporting evidence that Morrison had developed industrial-scale methods for disposing of human remains. These findings confirm the systematic nature of his operation and suggest that his criminal activities were even more extensive than contemporary investigations revealed. Forensic analysis of preserved bone fragments has provided insights into Morrison's killing methods and victim selection criteria. Evidence suggests that he targeted individuals across a wide age range and that his killing techniques became more efficient over time, indicating learning and adaptation that reflected systematic criminal development rather than impulsive violence. The Morrison case continues to influence contemporary discussions of criminal psychology, frontier history, and the social conditions that enable extreme deviance. Academic conferences, research publications, and educational programs regularly examine different aspects of his crimes and their broader historical and social significance. Modern law enforcement agencies study the Morrison case as an early example of systematic predatory behavior that exploited institutional vulnerabilities and social trust mechanisms. His success in operating undetected for extended periods provides insights into how contemporary criminals might exploit similar weaknesses in modern social and economic systems. The case has also influenced popular culture representations of frontier horror and criminal behavior. Morrison's story has inspired fictional works that explore themes of betrayed trust, hidden evil, and the vulnerability of isolated communities to systematic predation. These popular culture adaptations often emphasize the horror aspects of Morrison's cannibalistic practices, while using his story to examine contemporary concerns about trust, authenticity, and the potential for evil to hide behind normal social facades. The enduring appeal of his story reflects continuing fascination with extreme criminal behavior and the conditions that enable such deviance to flourish. Contemporary discussions of the Morrison case often focus on its relevance to modern concerns about institutional trust and the ability to identify dangerous individuals who present normal or appealing social personas. His success in maintaining respectability while conducting systematic atrocities illustrates challenges that remain relevant to contemporary security and safety concerns. The case serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy and helpful, who offer exactly what vulnerable people need most desperately. Morrison's transformation of frontier hospitality into a tool for systematic murder and cannibalism represents a betrayal that transcends individual crime to attack the fundamental bonds of trust that make civilized society possible. Modern psychological analysis of Morrison's case has identified patterns that remain relevant to contemporary understanding of serial murder and extreme criminal behavior. His systematic approach to victim selection, his ability to compartmentalize criminal activities, and his success in maintaining social respectability demonstrate characteristics that are found in many contemporary cases of systematic predation. The cannibalistic aspects of Morrison's crimes continue to challenge psychological and cultural understanding of human behavior. His ability to not only kill and consume human victims, but to serve their flesh to unsuspecting guests, represents a level of psychological detachment and moral violation that exceeds normal categories of criminal deviance. Research into the biological and psychological factors that might enable cannibalistic behavior has been influenced by historical cases like Morrison's, though ethical considerations limit the extent to which such extreme criminal psychology can be studied directly. The Morrison case provides historical evidence that helps inform contemporary understanding without requiring modern research subjects to be exposed to similar circumstances. The social and cultural factors that enabled Morrison's crimes continue to be relevant to contemporary discussions of community safety and institutional oversight. His exploitation of frontier hospitality traditions and his ability to operate without effective oversight illustrate vulnerabilities that can exist in any society where social trust is combined with limited institutional supervision. Modern communities that depend on tourism, hospitality, and service industries face similar challenges in balancing openness and trust with necessary security measures. The Morrison case provides historical perspective on these challenges while illustrating the potential consequences of inadequate oversight and prevention systems. Educational institutions continue to use the Morrison case as a teaching tool for courses in criminal justice, psychology, history, and anthropology. The case provides insights into multiple aspects of criminal behavior, social organization, and institutional response that remain relevant to contemporary analysis of deviance and social control. The pedagogical value of Morrison's story lies partly in its illustration of how extreme criminal behavior can emerge from seemingly normal social and economic circumstances. Students who study the case gain insights into the complex relationships between individual psychology, social environment, and institutional capacity that influence the development and control of criminal behavior. The Morrison case also provides opportunities for discussing ethical questions about criminal justice, punishment, and social responsibility that transcend its specific historical context. The extreme nature of his crimes raises questions about appropriate responses to ultimate evil and about the balance between individual rights and community safety that remain relevant to contemporary policy debates. Research into Morrison-related topics continues to produce new publications and academic papers that explore different aspects of his crimes and their broader historical and social significance. This ongoing scholarship reflects both the intrinsic interest of his case and its value as a window into larger patterns of frontier criminality and social organization. The site where Perdition Ranch once stood remains a place of morbid fascination for true crime enthusiasts, historians, and those interested in the darker aspects of frontier history. The harsh desert environment has reclaimed most traces of Morrison's buildings and operations, but the location continues to attract visitors seeking to understand how such extreme evil could have flourished in the American West. Local folklore and oral traditions have preserved various accounts of Morrison's crimes, though these narratives often include embellishments and fictional elements that reflect the storytelling needs of different communities, rather than historical accuracy. Nevertheless, these folk traditions demonstrate the lasting impact that Morrison's crimes had on regional memory and cultural understanding. The legacy of Ezekiel Morrison and Perdition Ranch serves as a permanent reminder that the capacity for ultimate evil can hide behind the most convincing facades of respectability and generosity. His systematic transformation of the sacred tradition of frontier hospitality into a tool for murder and cannibalism represents one of the most disturbing examples of predatory behavior in American history. Today, as we accept invitations from strangers and depend on the hospitality of those we do not know well, Morrison's story serves as a chilling reminder that some appetites cannot be satisfied through normal means, and that some hosts harbor hungers that civilized society cannot comprehend. His crimes remind us that the most dangerous monsters are sometimes those who welcome us most warmly and who seem most eager to share their table and their generosity. The winds that blow across the empty desert where Perdition Ranch once stood carry no trace of the horrors that occurred there, but the memory of Morrison's crimes continues to haunt our understanding of human nature and the delicate balance between trust and survival that defines civilized society. His story stands as an eternal warning that in a world where we must depend on the kindness of strangers, we must never forget that some strangers harbor appetites too terrible to imagine, and some hospitality comes at a price too horrific to pay.